There was a time when everything made sense. The closeness, the shared plans, the comfort of having someone there. It wasn't perfect, but it felt certain. Then, gradually, the familiar rhythm remained, but something within no longer moved in harmony with it. The space was the same, the gestures unchanged. And yet, inside, something quiet no longer responded. The soul notices what the mind overlooks. While conversations continue, while days go by untouched on the surface, an inner distance begins to form. Not as conflict, but as absence. It's not visible in actions, it's not spoken out loud, but it leaves a trace in every interaction, a sense that something essential has already stepped back. There's no need for disappointment to trigger this, no betrayal, no rupture. Sometimes, it's the slow realization that what once felt alive no longer reaches the same place. Care remains, respect holds, but the feeling of home is gone, and no amount of shared history can recreate it. This is the language of the soul. It doesn't demand explanations. It doesn't wait for validation. It simply no longer participates in the connection, as it once did. It detaches, not as punishment, but as recognition. A deeper truth rises to the surface. Staying now would require self-abandonment. That knowing doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with finality. No anger, no urgency. Just the realization that what once held meaning has reached its natural conclusion. The relationship may still appear intact, but something within already knows it's time to let go. This isn't a decision made by logic. It's a movement within. A message not crafted in words, but felt in every pause, every breath, every glance that no longer lands where it used to. And when the soul speaks in that way, not loudly but undeniably, there's no path back to what it was. Only the quiet certainty that remaining would be an act of forgetting oneself. There are bonds that seem strong because they were never tested by silence. They move smoothly, stay consistent, and provide a sense of safety. But beneath the comfort, something essential remains untouched. A connection can be steady and still fail to meet the parts of the self that are most alive. The early stages offer a sense of relief, not intensity, not recognition, but ease. Being with someone feels better than being alone, and that becomes enough. The other becomes a refuge from inner unrest, a way to postpone the weight of solitude. Affection exists, but it's often rooted more in need than in depth. Routines form quickly. There's rhythm, there's structure. The days begin to organize themselves around what feels familiar. And in that familiarity, the illusion of intimacy finds space to grow. Not because there's deception, but because it feels safer not to look deeper. Somewhere in the background, the soul keeps watch. It doesn't measure how much time is spent together or how much care is exchanged. It pays attention to something quieter, the absence of aliveness. And when it no longer finds vitality in the bond, it begins to withdraw, not abruptly, but with quiet certainty. Attempts to restore closeness often stay on the surface, planned conversations, gestures of affection, renewed efforts. But what's absent isn't attention, it's resonance. When the connection becomes maintenance, the soul begins to feel unrepresented, unseen, untouched. Even in the presence of loyalty and kindness, something starts to fall away. The gestures become automatic. The shared spaces feel increasingly unshared. And yet, there is no visible rupture, just the sense that the relationship is now being carried, not lived. It's difficult to name this while inside it. The fear of breaking something functional often outweighs the truth of its emptiness. The mind will try to rationalize. It will insist that this is how all relationships eventually become. But the soul doesn't agree, and it never settles where there is no longer meaning. The distance that grows isn't rejection. It's the soul reclaiming its voice. What looks like detachment is, in truth, a movement toward honesty, not to cause harm, but to stop pretending. And when the silence between two people no longer feels peaceful, but pressurized, it's not because something is wrong. It's because something essential has already stepped away, waiting to be acknowledged. Some decisions are not made through action. They happen quietly, deep within. A person stays, continues the routine, shares the same space, but the soul no longer meets what's unfolding. It observes, it registers, and eventually it withdraws. There comes a time when a connection no longer reflects who one has become. Nothing dramatic occurs. The surface remains intact. Words are exchanged, gestures repeated. Yet something has gone missing, the part of the self that once showed up fully. Familiarity can create the illusion of presence, but presence is not about being physically near. It's about alignment. And when that alignment dissolves, what remains is participation without essence. The soul recognizes this long before the mind allows it. The body might carry on. The voice may continue to speak kindly. But inside, the energy shifts direction. Not out of rejection, but because the bond no longer holds the same meaning. Staying becomes heavier, not because of conflict, but because of dissonance. The relationship is no longer a space of expansion. It begins to compress what was once open. And that compression is not sustainable, not for the heart, not for the truth growing inside. Attempts to recover what was often fail to address what is. Going back to old habits, revisiting memories, offering more effort, none of it reaches the core. Because what changed was not behavior. What changed was the connection between what is lived and what is felt. There are no simple explanations, no visible turning point, just a steady sense that the bond asks for something the soul can no longer give. Not because of lack, but because of change. A change so real, it cannot be ignored without self-betrayal. Remaining, then, becomes a form of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence of holding back what wants to live elsewhere. A silence that grows louder with time until it fills every corner of the relationship with the weight of what's unspoken. When that weight becomes constant, clarity follows, not as a sudden realization, but as the outcome of what has already been lived internally. The soul is no longer in agreement, and where the soul no longer agrees, staying becomes a performance, one that costs too much. Some emotions don't wait for permission. They enter quietly, but they settle deeply. Without warning, the familiar becomes uncomfortable. Not because anything has changed around you, but because something essential has already changed within. What does it mean when nothing is wrong, yet peace is missing? When attention is present, but it no longer lands anywhere meaningful? These are not signs of confusion. They are the earliest signs that a part of you is pulling away from what once felt like home. Restlessness doesn't always rush in. It builds through moments that no longer feel alive. A conversation repeated too often. A touch that no longer brings warmth. A silence that feels crowded instead of calm. Sometimes it begins with the body. A tension that lingers in your chest. A breath that no longer flows easily. The soul doesn't always speak through words. It speaks through the places in you that feel stuck, heavy, or resistant. Others might not notice anything has changed. You may not even know how to name it. But the feeling is there, marking the edges of something that no longer holds you honestly, not out of rejection, out of truth. You try to adjust, you show up, you play your part. But something about the connection now feels artificial. You see yourself moving through familiar motions without the same intention. The repetition doesn't bring comfort. It reminds you of what's missing. Stillness becomes hard to bear. Not because you need more stimulation, but because the silence is no longer shared. The quiet used to feel like a resting place. Now it feels like a question you can't answer. Even clarity can feel cruel when it arrives in soft, unavoidable ways. The realization is simple. You are no longer fully here. Your soul has already stepped back, waiting for the rest of you to stop pretending. That restlessness isn't asking for repair. It's not a request for more effort. It's not looking to be fixed. It's pointing to something honest, that the connection no longer reflects who you are now. You don't have to name it all at once. You only have to admit what you already know. When the feeling no longer passes, it's not a reaction. It's direction. Repetition isn't random. When the same emotional discomfort keeps returning in a relationship, it's not a coincidence. It's resistance. Something deep within is no longer willing to cooperate with what's happening on the surface. That resistance doesn't come to confuse you. It comes to show you what you've been avoiding. Some feelings don't arrive once and fade. They return. They press against the same parts of your day, at the same time, in the same moments. It could be during a conversation, after a shared silence, or just before sleep. And each time it feels familiar, not because it's unresolved, but because it's already been answered internally. You may respond with effort. You try again. You stay longer in the interaction. You soften your voice. You give more of your time. But the outcome repeats. You walk away with the same silence inside, the same feeling that something essential was untouched. That's not uncertainty. That's your soul refusing to blend with what no longer feels alive. Resistance in this form isn't about fear of change. It's the body mirroring a truth the mind hasn't fully accepted. Not all resistance is conflict. Often it looks like fatigue, like stillness after effort, like a kind of quiet that doesn't calm you. It drains you. You're not being tested. You're being shown the cost of continuing. When the same disconnection appears again and again, it's not an invitation to fix. It's a sign that your inner self is no longer able to pretend. The relationship may still function externally, but the repetition tells you that your participation has become mechanical. It's easy to mistake this for a phase. But repetition doesn't belong to the future. It belongs to what is unresolved right now. And the longer you stay in it, the more it feels like you're walking in circles with no direction, only delay. Letting go doesn't always follow pain. Sometimes it follows clarity. After recognizing the patterns that no longer shift, after noticing how the soul resists repetition, something quieter begins to form. It isn't about breaking ties. It's about realigning with what's true, without noise, without force, and often without being understood. When letting go is an act of integrity, it isn't fueled by conflict. It begins when remaining requires a version of yourself that feels incomplete. You continue the gestures, share the words, but a part of you no longer moves with them. The outside remains active, the inside stops responding. A decision forms slowly, not through pressure, but through honesty. You begin to notice how much of your presence is shaped to avoid discomfort. You stay kind, but less real. You stay available, but less whole. And little by little, the space between presence and authenticity becomes impossible to ignore. Some part of you stops rehearsing. You stop repeating what once worked. You stop dressing silence with effort. The soul doesn't announce anything. It just stops reaching. Not in protest, but because it no longer finds a mirror in the connection. Even comfort begins to lose meaning. What once offered security now feels like a room too small. Not because it changed, but because you did. And staying inside that space begins to feel like walking further away from yourself, one polite gesture at a time. Letting go, in these terms, is not a conclusion. It's a refusal to abandon what is quietly real. It's the moment you stop waiting for something to shift and start acknowledging what's already finished, without needing permission, without requiring blame. You recognize the cost of staying has changed. Not in dramatic ways, but in how much effort it takes to appear unchanged. Your silence grows heavier. Your responses arrive slower, not because you're uncertain, but because part of you is already elsewhere. There is nothing easy about it. But there is something unmistakably clean. Not pure, not ideal, just exact. You're not moving away from the other. You're moving back into alignment with yourself. The soul doesn't beg, it withdraws. It doesn't try to convince, persuade, or argue. It steps back, without explanation, when something once meaningful no longer holds its shape. And this withdrawal doesn't seek attention. It doesn't leave signs for the other to follow. It simply stops offering itself where it no longer feels received. There is a kind of absence that doesn't look like leaving. It happens slowly, without visible distance. Words are still exchanged. Daily life continues. But the essence is elsewhere. The body remains in the room, while something deeper turns inward and closes the door behind it. Not all departures happen through endings. Some happen through depletion. You speak, but the voice no longer carries truth. You stay, but the connection no longer carries depth. And the soul, sensing the lack of reflection, begins to retreat, not out of bitterness, but because nothing is echoing back. One morning, the gestures feel hollow. You notice the effort behind each interaction. You reach for closeness, but there's no part of you left in the act. This is not fatigue. It's the soul refusing to perform what no longer belongs to it. There are no warnings when this happens, no tension, no signals, just the steady erosion of participation. You stop anticipating, stop offering, stop explaining. You no longer look for understanding because your presence has already detached from the need to be seen there. Even empathy begins to fade, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped compromising your inner clarity to keep something alive. The soul knows when it's done, even if the heart still wants to hold on a little longer. You catch yourself listening less, responding with less weight, choosing silence not to punish, but because there's nothing true left to add. And this silence is not passive. It's directional. It marks the line where presence used to flow. The withdrawal is not cold. It's final. There's no tension, no resistance, only the absence of what once moved freely. And that absence doesn't ask for closure. It doesn't ask for acknowledgement. It simply no longer responds. By the time it's noticed by the other, the withdrawal is complete. What remains is not detachment, but completion. The soul has already gone where it needed to go, back to itself. Silence has a way of settling things the mind keeps turning over. It arrives not to erase what was lived, but to mark the moment when continuing no longer adds meaning. After all the conversations, all the efforts, and all the trying, silence becomes the clearest response. Not as withdrawal, but as confirmation that what needed expression has already been said, out loud or inwardly. When silence is a direction, not a defeat, it brings a different kind of presence. One that doesn't chase understanding or demand resolution. It carries the weight of everything that once mattered and releases the need to explain why it no longer does. This silence isn't empty. It's full of what has been seen, felt, and finally accepted. There's a difference between absence and peace. In this silence, nothing is waiting to be rescued. There is no tension, no anticipation, just the quiet certainty that the soul has turned its attention back to itself. And in that return, the need to be heard dissolves. Others may notice the quiet and wonder what it means, but the silence isn't asking to be interpreted. It isn't withholding. It's simply the only language left when nothing further needs to be sustained. In this stillness, something honest begins to take root. Not the hope of reconciliation, but the dignity of having honored the truth to its final breath. The silence doesn't echo, it holds. And what it holds finally is peace. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Not to the story that's ending. Not to the version of yourself that stayed longer than it should have. The silence you carry now isn't emptiness. It's evidence. It means you listened. It means something inside you refused to perform what no longer felt like truth. No one else needs to understand that. Some things are not meant to be explained in words. They're meant to be lived in silence, felt in solitude, honored without applause. If something inside you has already let go, then this isn't a decision you need to prepare for. It's a decision that's already been lived. Let the stillness be your answer. Let the absence of resistance guide you forward. Let the unfinished be enough. And if your soul no longer responds where it once reached, then you're not walking away. You're returning to yourself. If this spoke to something you've been carrying quietly, consider subscribing. Thank you for being here and for listening this far.